Hello everyone. Welcome to the second video of session 3. In this video, we're going to concentrate on using Gravit Designer. This is a result of some of the feedback we received this week during office hours. It turns out many of you are interested in learning how to use Gravit more effectively. To this end, we've created the following tutorial to show you how to construct a simple visual design from beginning to end. In this tutorial, you will learn how to leverage Gravit's rulers and guides, how to align and distribute visual objects, how to group visual objects and create copies of groups of objects, and we will also cover how to use layers effectively, as well as how to export our final designs for sharing. Our hope is walking through this process together will help all of you get the most out of this free design software. So let's get started. Hi everyone. In this tutorial, we're going to reconstruct the graphic that you see here on the screen. This was someone's example of volume times contrast in the Enter the Matrix assignment. And I've chosen to rebuild this particular image because I think it will allow us to review some of the basic and really fundamental features of Gravit design. So let me zoom in just a little bit. We can get a little bit better view. So you can see here, this is super simple. It's essentially more or less a square. And inside of the square, there are rows of black squares. In fact, it's a grid of 6 by 6 black squares. And then down in the lower left-hand corner, which obviously the eye is drawn to, is this blue circle that says CB. So let's go ahead and recreate this graphic together. You could see here I have a couple of pages. I've already created it, and I just want to show you, if I click on Final Design here and zoom out, this is what we're going to create together in this tutorial. So again, we've got a nice square canvas. We've got a 6 by 6 grid of black squares, and then in the lower right-hand corner, we have this blue circle that is labeled LTEC 620. And let's take a look at how I've built this. So if you look over on the left-hand side, I have different things in layers. So I have one layer called blue circle. I have another one called row 1, which happens to be the top, row 2, row 3, row 4, so on and so forth. And I have all of these layers locked. And in fact, the entire page, final design, is locked. So I'm going to unlock that just for a minute. And now what this allows me to do is I can hide things. So if I want to hide that blue circle, I can shut off its visibility. And if I expand the blue circle group, I can see it's made up of a blue ellipse and of course some white text. And if I wanted to select one of those, I can unlock that layer or I can collapse the group like so. And we have row 1, which happens to be the top here. And if I unlock that and select it, you can see it's showing up as selected here on the screen. And if I expand the group, I can see that it's actually made up of all of these individual rectangles or squares, which I've labeled rectangle 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And if I was to click through this, I could very easily hide the visibility of all of these items if I wanted to. Okay, so there you have it. This is what we're going to reconstruct together in this tutorial. So let me lock this, and I'm going to switch over to new design. And really what you're seeing here, new design, if we look over for this particular page, which page, I labeled it new design, and I have an infinite canvas. Now, what we want to do is resize the canvas because we want it to be a square. So what I'm going to do is just come up to the width and height boxes, and I'm going to manually type in 1,000 by 1,000 pixels, and then just hit enter. And we can see right away our canvas resizes to a nice square size, which is just what we want. Now, another thing that we can do is add a grid that can help us line up certain objects. And you can see here that every page there's a row here called grid, and by default it's off, but I want to turn that grid on. And when I do that, we can see let's zoom in a little bit. We can see there's actually a grid with faint gray lines that can help us line things up. Now I can change the scale of this grid. So for example, by default, it's 25 by 25 based on my settings in Gravit Designer. But if I wanted to have a larger grid, let's say 100 by 100, I could do that. And you can see after I hit enter, each of the squares of this grid is much smaller. And if we were to count these, it would be 10 by 10, because we know that the size of our canvas is 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels. And of course, we could go much smaller and change our grid to be 10 by 10. And here we have kind of a graph paper effect where we're seeing a 10 by 10 grid. So you could set that really at whatever is helpful for you. Now for me, for this particular exercise, I'm going to go ahead and make it 25 by 25, which will be helpful. Now, one point I want to make is if we were to export this design right now, what we would export is actually just the white canvas. We would not be able to see the grid. The grid is just for us as designers to help us with lining things up. So let's switch back over to final design for a minute. And the first thing that I want you to notice is that take a look that there's this nice white border all the way around the outside. And I happen to know that I spaced this out so it was about 50 pixels, more or less, all the way around. So we have a nice kind of border all the way around this particular design. So how can we do that systematically in our new design? Well, there's a couple of tools that can really make that super easy. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come up to View, and I'm going to ask to turn on the rulers. And I'm going to do that by clicking Show Rulers. And when that happens, actually, what you'll see is a ruler up here and a vertical ruler here. Now, we can use these rulers to measure things. And in particular, what they allow us to do is have something called guidelines, like this red line you're seeing right here. Now, you may or may, let me take this off. You may not have any guidelines. So one of the things you'll want to make sure that you've clicked on is Show Guidelines, this setting right here. It's right under Show Rulers. Now, when you do that, what this allows us to do is have these permanent red guidelines that we can use to make sure we line things up. So what I'm going to do, come up to the horizontal ruler, and I'm going to click and I'm going to drag down one horizontal ruler or guide, and I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to grab another one. I'm going to place it somewhat randomly down here at the bottom. Again, if I was to export this design, these guides would not be printed. You can't see those. This is just for us as designers to help us move things around and line things up. So what I want to do, I'm actually going to zoom in because I want this to be right at the 50th pixel. So I'm going to zoom in, say to about 400%. And then I'm going to use my panning tool or my view tool, and I'm going to just do a shortcut and hold down the space bar. And I'm going to drag my canvas down. And if I look over here, I can see the canvas starts at 0. Here's 10 pixels, 30 pixels, and that's actually the 50 pixel mark. I want this guideline to be right on the 50th pixel line. So I'm going to drag it and I'm going to plop it right there on the 50th pixel. And then of course, I am going to do the same thing at the bottom. So I'm going to scroll, holding down the space bar. I'm going to scroll all the way down at the bottom, and I want it to be fixed 50 pixels here from the bottom. Now, my grid is automatically telling me 25, 25. This should be 50 away, which happens to be the 950th pixel on my 100 or my 1000 by 1000 canvas. Okay, very good. So I'm going to come back over here to the zoom, and I'm going to zoom back out. Excellent. We have our top guideline and our bottom guideline. So now let's create some vertical guidelines. So I'm going to come over here to the left ruler, and I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to bring one over and just plop it down here on the right. I'm going to come back over to the ruler, click and drag again, and I'm going to plop one here on the left. Again, just like we did before, what we want to do is zoom in and make sure they're exactly where we want them to be. So I'm going to jump back into about 400 zoom, and I'm going to hold down my space bar, and I'm going to drag my canvas over. Because if I look up here, I've got my pixel measurements, and I really want this to be right on the 50th pixel. Excellent. And of course, I'm going to pan again over to the right, and I want this to be 50 pixels from the right-hand side, which we know, if we do a little bit of math, is the 950th pixel. And that's where I want that line to go. So I'm going to zoom out, and now I can see I've got these excellent vertical and horizontal guides that will help me. Now, if for some reason you don't want the guides visible, what you can do is just come up to View and say Toggle Show Guidelines. And if I do that, they disappear. They're still there. We could turn on their visibility again by just coming back and click Show Guidelines. Boom, they're back. Okay, so let's go back over to our final design here and take a look. And what we could see here is we have a row of 6 black squares. That's the primary visual object that we want to use. So let's go ahead and reconstruct that in the new design. So I'm going to click here and I'm going to come up to my shape tool and I'm going to drop it down, and I know I want a rectangle. I'm going to make sure that my fill color is black. So if I click on colors, I can see the black colors here. So I'm going to make sure that's selected. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to click and drag, holding down the shift key. Now, when you hold down the shift key, that's going to guarantee that you get a square shape. If you don't hold down the shift key, you could end up with a rectangle, but I don't want that. What I want is an actual square. And so if I click on this, I can move it around. Really what I want to do is come over here and I get some information about this. Now, right at the moment, it's 100 by 100. So if I want to keep the square ratio, I want to make sure we see this white button turned on. That's going to lock the aspect ratio. And essentially what I want to do is just type in 125. Now, importantly, I want to make sure that this black square is right up here in the left-hand corner. If I zoom in, it's pretty easy to see that it's snapping right to my guidelines, which is fantastic. That's super helpful. Now, some of you may not have that feature on. See, you can see the magnet here. This is going to toggle on and off your snapping tool. And so if it's off, it's really easy to be off just by a pixel or two. But if it's on, then it's going to help you snap right to your guidelines, which is really helpful. Now I can confirm that this upper left-hand corner of this square is at an X position of 50 and a Y position of 50 up here. So if I look at the position, the X value is 50 and the Y value is 50. Now, my next question is, how many squares do we need going across the top row? So I'm going to switch back over to my final design and zoom out a little bit. And if we count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I need 6. So let's come back over to my new design. Now I could actually come up and I could draw 6 different squares. But to be more efficient, I don't have to do that. I can actually copy this visual object that I've already created. And the way that you do that is just select the object that you want to copy, and you can hold down the Alt key, and if you just click and drag, you're going to get it's going to make an exact copy. And you could see how helpful Gravit's being. It's giving me lots of measurements and helping me trying to line things up. So how many do I have here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I need one more. Now, importantly, I want these to be equally spread out, and I want to use up all of my editable area here. So this square on the right, I want to make sure it snaps all the way to the right guideline. There are some helpful tools in Gravit. So if I click here, I can see it's, and let me zoom in a little bit so we can see that, and I'm going to pan here. I can see that it's right on that upper right-hand corner, right where I want it to be. Now, I have a problem, which is these spaces in between my black squares are not the same. There's a bigger space here. Now, I could manually try to go here in here and kind of futz around. Luckily, image editing software makes tasks like this really easy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag to select all 6 of my boxes. And then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to put my mouse over this button right here, which is the distribution button. And notice it's distribute horizontally. And essentially what's going to happen when I click that, it's going to distribute all 6 of those visual objects horizontally and evenly. So now what I have is just a beautiful spreading out of these 6 visual objects. I can also use some of my alignment tools. So I want them all to be aligned at the top, and they should already be, but I'm going to click the Align the Top button. And now what I want to do is actually group these objects so I can copy the whole group. So what I'm going to do with all of these 6 visual objects selected, if you need help selecting them, I'll just click outside here to deselect it. I'm just going to drag and drop and select all of them. and then I'm going to right click on one of them, and I'm going to say group selection. And notice what happened here in my layers. Rather than having 6 objects at the root level, I have one group now. And if I expand that group, I have those 6 squares, black squares inside of them. And what's nice about that is I can actually toggle the visibility now of the whole group. So let's find out how many rows of black squares do we need. Let's jump over to the final design and we'll count down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So just like we had 6 black squares going across, we need a grid of 6 going down. So let's come over to our new design. And conveniently, what we can do now is we can just click and drag. I'm going to hold down my control button, and I'm just going to create 5 copies. There's copy 1, click and drag, holding down the control key, click and drag, click and drag. How many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I need one more, and I'm going to drag it. Good. Now, again, we've got the spacing problem. So I have 6 groups now, but I have similar spacing problems. So first thing I want to do is make sure, is this bottom row exactly where I want it vertically? So let's zoom in here a little bit. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom, and it looks like it's lined up beautifully right there because it's snapping to my guidelines, which is good. So let me zoom back out. And now what I want to do is I'm going to select all of these 6 groups. And again, I'm going to tell them I want you to align to the left this time, just to make sure they're all lined up left. And now I'm going to use the distribution tool. But instead of distributing them horizontally, I'm going to distribute them vertically. And watch the impact that happens. When I click this button, click, it's going to perfectly space those out for me. And so I have this nice, beautiful, vertically distributed row of 6 black squares. Okay, very good. Now, one of the things I notice is all of my layers are labeled group by default. That's not very useful. So what I want to do is select them, and I'm actually going to number them. Because we created this one first, it happens to be at the bottom. So I'm going to double click on this, and I'm going to actually relabel this from group to row, and I'm going to call it 01, and I'm just going to say that this is the top. And then I'm going to click out of that. So that has a nice, meaningful name now. And if I select the next group, I can see here, this is what's selected. I'm going to double click on the word group, and I'm just going to call this row 2. And then I'm just going to keep doing this for all 6 rows now. Row 4, row 5, and row 6. I'm going to add into row 6 that's the bottom row. Now, I don't like that the bottom row is actually my top layer. So one of the things that Gravit Designer allows us to do is to reorder layers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on row 1, and I'm going to drag it right up to the top and set it down. Then I'm going to do the same thing for row 2, the same thing for row 3, 4, and then just to be different, I'll drag row 6 down. Good. So now if I click on the top layer, my top row is selected. If I click on my number 2 row, this one's selected. Good. So it's right in order. And now what I want to do is I want to lock these layers because I don't want them to change. I've got it just the way I want it. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to lock all those layers. Now let's come back over to our final design. And we can see actually that it's row 5 that is different than all of the other rows. And in particular, how's it different? Well, first steps first, there is no black square there. So let's go ahead and make that change in our new design. So I'm going to click on the new design page. Now, if I come straight to row 5 and try to click, Gravit's not going to let me select this particular square. Why is that? Well, that's because row 5 is locked. So what I need to do is unlock row 5, and I can expand it if I want. But now if I come in here, I can click on things. Now, if I just click once, I've selected the whole row. But if I click specifically on the 5th square, notice that that square has focus. So what I want to do now is I'm going to select that, and I am going to delete it by clicking the delete key on my keyboard. And now what I want to do is I am going to collapse row 5 and I'm going to lock it. So the next task in front of us is to create the blue circle and put a little bit of text on it. And then we're pretty much done with this tutorial. So let's come up to our shape tool. And right now I have rectangle selected, but what I need is actually an ellipse. So I'm going to click on the ellipse. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the shift key because I want it to be a perfect circle. Remember, we don't want it to be shaped like this or like this. We don't want it to be an ellipse. We want it to be a perfect circle. So I'm going to go ahead and draw something that's approximately the right size. I'm just holding down the shift key. Boom. And I can tell this is too big. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my size information here, and I'm going to make sure my aspect ratio button is clicked. And then I'm going to change the width and height to be 125. And if I change one, the other one will automatically change. Now what I want to do is I want to make sure I have this lined up just perfectly. And now in order to do that, I want to add a couple of guidelines. But first, let me zoom in a little bit here. I'm going to come into 300 and I'm going to pan right into where we want this. And what I mean is I want this to be lined up perfectly with the edge of the squares above and below it and to the left and to the right of it. I'm going to come over to my vertical ruler and I'm going to create a new guide, and I'm going to place that guide right on the edge of these black squares. And then I'm going to come back over. So I've got the left side, and now I'm going to come over and do the left side. Boom, I'm going to drop it right there. And I want to do the same thing for my horizontal guide. So I'm going to come up to the top. I'm going to click and drag, and I'm going to line right up with the top, right about there. Okay, good. Then I'm going to release, and then I'm going to come back up. I'm going to get another guide, and I'm going to line it up just as close as I can here with the bottom of this row of black squares. So now with this, what I can do is I'm going to select my circle, and using the keyboard, I'm just going to inch it into place. And we'll see here that it fits beautifully right into the middle of those guidelines. So my next task is to change the color of this. So I'm going to make sure my circle is selected, and I'm going to click on the fill. You can pick any blue you want, or literally whatever color you want. You can just pick anything that's close to it, whatever you feel like. You can, whatever makes you happy there. So I'm going to pick this blue here. Now what we want to do is put some text on top of this. So you could see here, all my layers are locked, but I have a new layer that's holding the ellipse. So let's rename this and call this blue circle. I'm going to lock this for a moment. And now what I want to do is come up and grab my text tool. So I'm going to click here. And then I'm just going to create a text box, something like this. And I'm going to go in, I'm going to type in LTEC, enter. I want to go to the next line, 620. And now importantly, I want to style this text a little bit. So I'm going to come over to the appearance panel. And first and foremost, I want the text to be white. And now I want to center the text. Okay, very good. By default, it's at size 20. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. Let's go up to say 30, see what that looks like. Okay, now when I did that, you can see it didn't quite size properly. That's okay. We'll fix that in a minute. So what I'm going to do is click out of it and click back on it so I have my resizing handles. And I want this to be pretty much snapped to my red guidelines. So if you can't get it to snap there, what you can do is just hold down the control key and it will snap. It'll allow you to resize it just the way you want it right there. And I'm going to have to pull this down so we can see the second line of text right there. Good. Now, one of the things I notice is that in my opinion, there's too much space between these letters, the two lines of text. So we know from our typography session that we can actually change the space between lines of text. Right now it's at 100%. Let's drop that down to say 60%. And that's a bit tight. So maybe let's go up to 70% just to give it a little more breathing room. Good. And now what I want to do is I want to perfectly line up. I want to center this text on this blue circle. So what I'm going to do is unlock my blue circle. And what I'm going to do is hold down shift. I'm going to click my blue circle, and then I'm going to holding down shift. I'm going to select my blue or my white text. Notice they're both selected now. And what I want to do is come over here to my align to the center. I'm going to click that. Now they're already aligned to the center. And I also want to align to the middle. And you can see that bumped it up perfectly right in the center. And now what I want to do is group these two objects. So with them both selected, I'm going to right click, group selection, and you could see over here in my layers, Gravit has given this group the default name of group. And if I was to expand it, I can see there's text and there's a blue circle. And so what I want to do now is rename this from group to blue circle, so that that layer has its own unique name. And I just got to click out of there to make it hold. And I'm going to lock that layer. Now let's zoom out so we can see everything. Let's turn off our guidelines. I'm going to come up to view. I'm going to toggle show guidelines, and boom, we've got this nice, beautiful replication of this particular design here. And I think actually for aesthetic purposes, I'm going to shut off the grid just while I'm looking at this, just to make sure everything looks good. And now if I wanted to export this, I'm going to click File, Export. I'm going to click Export, and I'm going to deselect. So the only thing I want is the new design. So I don't want to export all. I need to deselect that. That shuts everything off. The only thing I want to export is new design. I want to make sure portable network graphic or PNG is my setting, and I want my default size to be 300 DPI so that there's a lot of information in there. Don't accidentally select everything like I just did. I'm going to export it, and it's going to ask me, what do you want to call this? Well, I have my Gravit file is called square circle demo.gv design. I'm going to make it have the exact same name, and I'm just going to click save. And if I come over to my desktop, you can see here I've got two files, square circle demo, Gravit design, square circle demo, PNG. And if I do a quick look at that, I've got this really nice PNG, high quality. And we did it fairly efficiently using the rulers, the guidelines, and having nice, clean, organized layers. And there you have it, folks, another tutorial on how to use Gravit Designer. Thanks.